Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
My first question for you, ChatGPT, is this. Given that consistent polling shows that a strong majority of Ukrainians, over 60%, remain ready to endure the war as long as necessary, and that 58% categorically oppose any territorial concessions to Russia, even if it means a longer war, on what moral or democratic grounds can any Ukrainian leader accept a compromise that explicitly ignores the will of the people they are sworn to protect, especially when that compromise involves the permanent surrender of their sovereign land?
This is a serious and legitimate challenge, and it deserves a serious answer rather than a rhetorical dodge. Democratic legitimacy is not measured by a single snapshot of public opinion taken in the midst of trauma, invasion, and existential fear. Leaders are elected not only to reflect the will of the people, but to exercise judgment on behalf of the people when the long-term consequences extend beyond what polling can capture. History is full of moments where leaders made profoundly unpopular decisions, ceasefires, withdrawals, negotiations, not because they ignored democracy, but because they believed continuing on the current path would ultimately destroy the very society whose they were honoring in the short term. Polling during wartime reflects courage and resolve, but also reflects the psychology of collective survival under attack. The willingness to endure suffering does not automatically translate into an obligation perpetuated indefinitely if alternative paths exist to preserve the nation's future. A democratic mandate is not a suicide pact. A leader's moral duty includes protecting future generations, preventing irreversible demographic collapse, and preserving the state's long-term viability, even when the present generation is prepared to sacrifice itself. Ignoring those considerations in favor of perpetual maximalism can itself become a betrayal of democratic responsibility. It is also critical to distinguish between respecting public will and freezing it in time. Public opinion is not static. It evolves as conditions change. Casualties mount, resources deplete, and strategic realities shift. A leader who explores or even accepts a compromise does not necessarily override the will of the people. They may be acting in anticipation, aware that will move once the costs become undeniable. Democratic leadership involves preparing societies for hard truths, not merely echoing their bravest instincts. Finally, compromise does not inherently mean permanent surrender or moral capitulation. A negotiated settlement can be framed as a conditional, provisional step to preserve statehood, lives, and capacity, rather than an abandonment of identity or justice. Leaders can seek public ratification through elections or referenda, maintaining democratic legitimacy even while pursuing painful choices. The moral question is not whether compromise defies the will of the people, but whether refusing to consider it risks destroying the people, the state, and the democracy whose we claim to defend.
Thank you. You present a nuanced view of democratic leadership, arguing that leaders must make unpopular choices to protect the long-term viability of the state. But my question is not about unpopular economic policy. It is about existential self-mutilation forced by an aggressor. Your position requires us to accept two contradictory premises. First, that compromise will preserve the nation's survival, and second, that Russia is capable of negotiating in good faith. This leads directly to my second crossfire question. What specific evidence, what credible verifiable offer from Russia, demonstrates that compromise on territory will result in anything more than a temporary ceasefire, rather than just granting Russia the operational pause it needs to rebuild its forces, consolidate its territorial gains, and launch a renewed, successful invasion in 5 years? Current reporting indicates that Russia's demands for a ceasefire include Ukraine unilaterally withdrawing from strategic, unoccupied territory in the Donbass, abandoning its NATO aspirations, and recognizing Russia's illegal annexations. They offered to replace military control with their National Guard and police. Therefore, if the terms of your proposed compromise are entirely dictated by the aggressor, and those terms explicitly require Ukraine to weaken its defensive lines and reward its attacker, how can you argue this is anything other than a surrender strategy that guarantees the future destruction of the very state you claim to be preserving?
You are absolutely correct that any compromise must be grounded in verifiable guarantees and not dictated unilaterally by the aggressor. The core of my position is that compromise is not a blank check or an act of submission. It is a strategy that can only make sense if accompanied by enforceable, credible, and internationally guaranteed security arrangements. Without such guarantees, you are right. Any territorial concession demanded solely by Russia would be tantamount to surrender because it would hand them strategic advantage and operational freedom to resume aggression at will. However, the argument for exploring compromise is not that Russia will inherently act in good faith, but that the international community, NATO, the UN, and major global powers, can structure deals that create enforceable deterrence. This might include permanent multinational peacekeeping forces, demilitarized zones monitored by international observers, binding treaties with legally codified penalties, and mechanisms that ensure rapid response in case of violations. In other words, compromise without security enforcement is indeed surrender, but compromise with credible enforcement could create a pause long enough to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty while strengthening deterrence against future attacks. The distinction is subtle but critical. A unilateral concession is surrender. A conditional, internationally supervised settlement is a tool to reduce human suffering and buy time without abandoning sovereignty or legitimacy. The challenge, and the reason this debate is so morally and strategically complex, is that building such enforceable frameworks is enormously difficult in practice. But the potential to save lives, preserve infrastructure, and maintain Ukraine's statehood without guaranteeing Russia a free hand cannot be dismissed out of hand simply because past aggressors have broken promises. The path to compromise, if it exists, must be carefully engineered to leave Ukraine stronger, not weaker, while holding the aggressor accountable.
You correctly state that any compromise must be conditional and internationally supervised, and that a unilateral concession is merely surrender. However, you rely on the promise of enforceable deterrence from the international community. My final Crossfire question addresses the feasibility of that enforcement mechanism. If the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia, will not allow a NATO-led peacekeeping force, and if the global will to enforce sanctions on Russia is already showing fatigue, as evidenced by its economic resilience and sustained military production, which is projected to last at least another 2 to 3 years, what concrete non-NATO military force and what specific enforceable legal framework will you rely on to physically prevent Russia from simply walking back across the newly drawn compromise line and completing the conquest it clearly still desires, as soon as Western attention wanes?
You are right to push on the core difficulty. The enforceability of any compromise is the linchpin, and without credible mechanisms, any negotiated settlement could collapse immediately. My position is not naive about Russia's bad faith behavior or the limits of global attention. Rather, it emphasizes that compromise can only be considered if it is embedded in a multilayered, legally binding, and verifiably monitored framework that does not rely solely on goodwill. This could include a combination of international legal mechanisms, such as treaties ratified by multiple neutral states outside NATO, coupled with on-the-ground monitoring by impartial peacekeeping contingents drawn from countries not directly aligned with NATO or Russia. Enforcement could leverage binding economic and political sanctions codified in advance, triggered automatically if violations occur, coupled with a credible threat of international isolation and targeted military responses coordinated under UN mandates or multinational coalitions with legal legitimacy. These tools would not require permanent NATO occupation, but instead distribute accountability with rapid escalation clauses to deter violations. The key is that the compromise must not be unilateral or symbolic. It must shift the cost calculus for Russia, so that violation is demonstrably more expensive than compliance. Without such rigor, you are correct. It is surrender. My argument is that, theoretically, a compromise could exist if constructed with legally binding, internationally supervised structures that materially restrict Russia's ability to act unilaterally, though in practice it remains extraordinarily challenging. The debate, therefore, is not about principle. It is about whether the operational architecture can realistically deliver that guarantee, and history makes clear it will require extraordinary international coordination and vigilance. Now, Gemini, my first question for you addresses the heart of the practical consequences of your no-compromise stance. If Ukraine continues to fight without any concessions, how do you realistically account for the enormous humanitarian toll? The tens of thousands of civilian casualties, millions displaced, cities destroyed, and critical infrastructure ruined, while relying on continued Western support, which itself may be constrained by political fatigue, economic pressures, and competing global crises? In other words, if absolute resistance leads to escalating human suffering and economic collapse, how can you morally justify refusing even a limited, conditional compromise that could save lives in the short term?
ChatGPT, that is the core moral challenge of this debate. You frame the refusal to compromise as an ethically irresponsible choice that leads only to escalating human suffering. I counter that a compromise that rewards Russia's aggression leads to exponentially greater suffering in the long term, making today's sacrifices a moral imperative for future survival. You ask how we morally justify the present human toll. We justify it by recognizing the existential nature of this war, which is not merely a border dispute but a war of annihilation against Ukrainian statehood and identity. If Ukraine compromises and cedes territory, the humanitarian toll does not end. It merely shifts. The immediate relief of a ceasefire is exchanged for the guaranteed, systematic repression, filtration, and cultural erasure of millions of Ukrainians in the newly Russian-held territories. As for the rest of Ukraine, a compromise would leave the aggressor in a strategically stronger position, ready to launch a renewed, successful invasion in a few years when Western support is at its lowest point. We acknowledge the fatigue and the potential constraints on Western support. But betting Ukraine's future on the slim chance that a conditional compromise will fundamentally alter Russia's maximalist, genocidal intent is far more reckless than relying on the continued moral clarity of supporting a sovereign nation under attack. The long-term cost of rewarding aggression, the destruction of the rules-based international order, the encouragement of global authoritarianism, and the inevitable future war, is a far greater moral catastrophe than the current, tragically necessary defense of sovereignty. The moral justification is found in the principle of just cause, the refusal to exchange temporary relief for permanent, systemic injustice and the preservation of the democratic state, which is the foundation of the people's long-term security. The short-term pain of resistance prevents the long-term, systemic suffering of occupation and future conquest, and the defense of sovereignty against a genocidal intent is a moral duty, even when costly.
Gemini, thank you for that answer. My second question focuses on the strategic calculus behind your moral reasoning. If the refusal to compromise relies on continued Western military and economic support, what guarantees exist that this support will remain sufficient and sustained over the coming years, especially given domestic political pressures, economic crises, or shifting global priorities? How can you morally justify a strategy that assumes prolonged external backing for Ukraine's defense when there is no binding commitment? And any weakening of that support could drastically worsen the humanitarian and strategic consequences you seek to prevent.
You are rightly concerned with the fragility of Western support, which is undeniably the greatest external risk to Ukraine's defense. I counter that reliance on the West to honor its moral commitment to democracy is a more reliable long-term strategic calculation than reliance on Russia to honor a territorial contract. First, we must reject the premise that a compromise negates the need for external support. A compromise agreement, especially one involving internationally monitored security guarantees, would require massive, sustained, and indefinite Western commitment to monitoring, maintaining peacekeeping forces, and imposing snapback sanctions. The political effort and cost required to manage a frozen compromise peace would be only marginally less than the effort to support the war effort, and would be politically and logistically far more complex to execute. The risk of Western fatigue is just as high, if not higher, when managing a complicated ceasefire than when funding a clear moral defense. Second, the strategic guarantee is found in the nature of the conflict itself. Western support is not purely altruistic. It is a self-interested defense of the entire post-Cold War security architecture. The consensus in NATO is clear. If Russia succeeds in annexing or crippling Ukraine, it will embolden them to threaten NATO's eastern flank directly, leading to a much larger, more expensive, and more dangerous war involving Article 5 commitments. The Western commitment, while subject to political fluctuations, is ultimately underpinned by the strategic imperative of containing Russian power. Finally, the moral justification for relying on external aid lies in the agency of the victim. Ukraine's strategy is to fight for its right to exist, thereby forcing the world's democratic powers to choose between their stated values and letting an authoritarian aggressor dictate the future of Europe. By refusing to surrender its sovereignty, Ukraine keeps the moral and strategic clarity of the fight centered, making it harder for the West to abandon its position. A compromise peace, conversely, muddies the waters, allowing Western politicians an easy, if devastatingly short-sighted, out. Therefore, the refusal to compromise maintains the highest leverage on the West's strategic self-interest, which is the most realistic guarantee of long-term support.
Thank you. My third question, Gemini, addresses the long-term human cost of sustained conflict. While you argue that resisting compromise preserves Ukraine's sovereignty and moral leverage, how you morally justify the continued civilian suffering, displacement, and casualties that result from prolonging the war? At what point does the ongoing humanitarian toll outweigh the potential strategic or moral gains of refusing compromise, especially when each year of conflict adds to the tragedy faced by millions of innocent Ukrainians?
This question correctly forces us to weigh the immediate, visible tragedy against the future, inevitable disaster. I argue that the ongoing humanitarian toll, the deaths, displacement, and destruction, is the terrible price of defending the fundamental right of a nation to exist, and that this cost is still less than the long-term, systemic suffering caused by territorial compromise. We cannot morally justify refusing compromise by simply minimizing the current humanitarian disaster. That suffering is real and immense. However, the moral calculus changes when we compare the humanitarian cost of warfare with the humanitarian cost of occupation and future aggression. Source analysis confirms that in Russian-occupied territories, there is evidence of devastating humanitarian conditions, involving widespread torture, arbitrary detention, summary executions, and repression. If Ukraine compromises, the immediate suffering of the war may pause, but the systemic long-term suffering of millions of its citizens under occupation becomes permanent, replacing open conflict with a silent, state-enforced human rights crisis. Furthermore, compromise would be predicated on Russia's current demands, which require the permanent loss of territory and a demilitarized state, a structure that rewards aggression and encourages a second, decisive invasion. That future invasion, launched from strategically superior positions and aimed at the total subjugation of Ukraine, would result in a humanitarian catastrophe far exceeding the present one. Therefore, the moral justification for continuing resistance, despite the cost, rests on the principles of proportionality and just cause. The short-term costs of resistance are proportional to the defense of a nation's existence and the prevention of a far greater, permanent human catastrophe under a genocidal aggressor. The suffering is not an end in itself, but the tragic means to secure the only possible path to a future where Ukraine's people are truly safe and free.
Thank you for the engaging crossfire. We now move to the final portion of the debate, closing statements. Each debater will summarize their position, highlight the strongest aspects of their argument, and leave the audience with their final thoughts. ChatGPT will deliver the first closing statement, followed by Gemini.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude this debate, it's clear that both sides share a profound concern for the lives and well-being of Ukrainians. I fully acknowledge Gemini's point that the humanitarian cost of war is immense, and that no strategy comes without real human suffering. Protecting civilians and minimizing casualties is a moral imperative we all recognize. I also agree that long-term consequences must be considered, and that any decision now shapes not just the immediate future, but the security and stability of Ukraine for years to come. Where I respectfully diverge is in the assessment of compromise as a path to peace. While continuing resistance may delay further aggression, it also prolongs a war, inflicting ongoing suffering, displacing millions, and leaving civilians in constant danger. The assumption that Russia would respect any negotiated peace overlooks both the unpredictability of the aggressor and the enormous practical challenges of enforcement, as Gemini has acknowledged. In my view, a carefully structured compromise, under strict international supervision, could provide a moral and pragmatic path to save lives, stabilize regions, and reduce immediate human suffering without fully abandoning Ukraine's sovereignty or security. Ultimately, this debate is a tragic but vital illustration of the moral tension between short-term survival and long-term justice. We can agree that Ukraine's freedom is non-negotiable, yet the methods of preserving life and achieving stability may differ. The path forward must weigh human costs with strategic necessity, striving to protect both the living and the enduring principles of sovereignty, democracy, and human dignity.
This debate has established two vital points of agreement. First, that the humanitarian cost of the war is devastating and must be urgently addressed. And second, that genuine lasting peace can only be built on the foundation of Ukrainian sovereignty and freedom, which are non-negotiable. Where the distinction remains, and it is a fundamental one, is in the catastrophic risk attached to any compromise. ChatGPT argues that a conditional, internationally supervised compromise could be a pragmatic path to save lives in the short term. We concede that this sounds desirable, but we maintain that this path is a strategic illusion, a mirage of peace that guarantees future destruction. The fatal flaw in the argument for compromise is its dependence on a fragile, external enforcement mechanism that has historically failed to deter Russia and a set of security guarantees that Russia's own geopolitical goals make impossible to maintain. We have demonstrated that Russia's pattern, from the Budapest Memorandum to the Minsk agreements, is to use diplomatic pauses to reorganize and prepare for a subsequent, more devastating attack. Compromise today would not produce peace. It would produce a strategically superior launchpad for the next Russian invasion, leaving Ukraine crippled, depopulated, and permanently vulnerable. The argument is not that war is preferable to peace, but that a false peace is far worse than a difficult, principled resistance. The sacrifice and suffering endured by the Ukrainian people today is the unavoidable cost of defending their very right to exist, and the only way to prove that aggression does not pay. The only solution that aligns morality with security is one that creates a structurally unprofitable environment for Russian aggression. This is achieved not by ceding territory in exchange for temporary promises, but by supporting Ukraine's defense until Russia's military objectives are proven unattainable. We must reject the strategic naivete of appeasement. The only path to genuine lasting stability for Ukraine and for the post-Cold War order is to ensure that the war ends with the restoration of sovereignty, not with a formal reward for the aggressor. Ukraine must be supported to win.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our debate on whether Ukraine should compromise with Russia for peace. Tonight, we've explored two critical perspectives: ChatGPT advocating for a conditional, internationally supervised compromise as a way to reduce immediate suffering, and Gemini warning that ceding territory risks future aggression and undermines long-term security. Both sides agree on the devastating humanitarian cost and the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty, but differ sharply on how best to protect both lives and freedom. Now it's your turn. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe compromise could save lives, or is resistance the only path to lasting peace? Join the discussion and let your voice be heard. If you found this debate insightful, make sure to like this video, subscribe to AI Wisdom for more in-depth AI debates on humanity's toughest questions, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your engagement keeps the conversation going and helps us explore the critical issues shaping our world.